Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this virtual professional development opportunity. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Today, I'm happy to have Natasha Scott, the Director of Educator Engagement at iCivics, joining us today. In our session for today, she's going to be talking about the lens of history and civics as a way to talk about social justice. She's going to be talking about some of the work that iCivics and Civics Now has been doing across the country with different groups. And we are here in Maine. We're going to get to benefit from that learning. So without any further ado, Natasha.
Thank you, Joe. Wonderful to see everyone today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited. So we're going to have, our session today is definitely going to be very interactive and engaging. Really want to make sure that you have the opportunity to raise any questions. So feel free to throw those in the chat as we're going along. And we're going to actually go back and forth between a slide deck, kind of going through some overview elements, and then also coming back and having opportunities for you to actually kind of share your thinking and reflect and build that sense of community, even though we're in this virtual space. So with that being said, I am going to share my screen now and we will get started on our slide deck. So today, when we think about history and civic education, social justice, really thinking about this work of this project of educating for American democracy. Now, this project is a national project. As you can see below, there are several organizations that have been coming together to do this work really over the last year. So we're going to dive deeper in terms of what those elements are and how they bring to the surface the tension that we see in history and civics, and have conversations about the connections we can make to our own classroom instruction as we go through that. So as Joe had shared, we do have a site that we'll use for today's conversation. Now, this site is really just a place that's going to capture some thoughts, some ideas, creating some space for interactivity that normally, when we think about it in person, it would have been a turn and talk. I like to think of them now as a think and type. I know, it's just, you just can't help these corny jokes. But so as we think about that, you'll see that throughout this session too. So if you aren't able to open that, Joe has put that link into the chat. So please look for that, as we will use that to guide our session today. And we're actually going to, as I've gone over our agenda, some different structures we're using, introductions. So I'm going to now, if you open up that website page, you'll see here, just a couple of logistical walkthroughs before we jump in. The same slide deck that I am using today for our conversation is embedded here. Sometimes we just like to be able to have that access to either make it larger on our screen or just make it more accessible for ourselves. That is there. I've also included some resources here. So as our conversation today is very high level, kind of going over these different elements of the Educating for American Democracy roadmap, these different resources are really going to be something that you can go back later and you can check out in more depth the content themes, the design challenges, look at that introductory video that really gives that high level overview of this project and kind of get that whole sense of it. So you'll be able to go through those resources as well. That's why they're linked out there. And let's actually go down to our first Padlet and just let's get to know where everyone's from. So yes, we know we're in Maine, but tell us where your school district is located. So this, one of my loves for Padlet here, think of it as like a digital anchor chart where you can take your Post-it notes, stick it on, and show us where you're from. So if you click on the plus sign, it will give you the opportunity to place your district there. So as you can see, we've been having this conversation with teachers and educators, professional development providers, students all across the country, which has been really amazing because as you can see, as we think about this national work, it's really essential to get those kind of perspectives from everyone in all of these different places. So I can see Maine getting a few more pointers on that, which is great. Let's see if we can zoom in over in that area. So thank you for adding yourself, just helping us think about this discussion and where we've been. So as we jump back into the slide deck. So when we think about this Educating for American Democracy project and the purpose behind it, it's really setting the standard. It's prioritizing history and civic content and approaches and debates that are essential to robust and authentic civic participation, including both the painful challenges and those exceptional achievements. As we think about that tension that we see in the classroom, when we get to these this in-depth content, this is actually a project that's very different because it actually leans into those tensions. Part of the reason for this work overall, as we think about history and civics and history and civic education, we realize just the nation hasn't been putting it at the forefront in terms of the place that it needs to be. When we think about the funding allocated, we see that STEM education is getting $50 per student per year, while civic education is 5 cents. So a nickel per student per year. When we think about that work and think about, well, what do we actually need to be able to do in order to be able to engage deeper in these conversations and get to that tension? And as we think about some of the other national frameworks that we have out there, the C3 framework, the college, career, and civic life framework, we have the No Child Left Behind, focus on ELA and math. So this is really taking the opportunity to hone in and focus on that history and civics instruction within the classroom. The goal for this work, big picture, really making sure that we are offering guidance on setting standards for history and civic instruction, okay, building student knowledge and capacities to sustain America's constitutional democracy. In order to do that, we have to build the capacity for excellence in K-12 history and civic education. You can't have really strong history and civics instruction without engaging in these different elements. Now, when we think about this guidance and what we see, it's really thinking about how to teach American history and civics in an integrated way, okay? How to prioritize content essential to robust and authentic civic participation, including those untold or seldom told stories in American history, and why productive debate on these topics matter. So when we think about that tension that we see, this framework and this history and civic roadmap actually wants you to engage with that tension and get at those untold or seldom told stories in American history. Not like oftentimes I feel like what we see is that's kind of pushed aside and say, this is a little hard, we're going to avoid this, but actually diving right in. When we think about the development of this, I laugh a little because it's been a year-long project where we've really been diving deep with multi-institution and cross-partisan team of experts, thinking about the content and pedagogy. So along with this resource in terms of having this robust collection of questions that we can use and questions and themes and to guide inquiry, also comparing that with a pedagogy companion. So not just thinking about, hey, here's the content, but also here's how you can actually use it in the classroom. And as we dive into some of the examples, you'll see how this actually encourages us to wrestle to those hard histories and design challenges, and not just stepping away and shying away from it. And thinking about how we foster civil disagreement, civic friendship, reflective patriotism, and productive debate within our history and civics discussions. So when we think about kind of how many people have been involved with this project, as I come to you, we think about over 100 people. We've had task forces, steering committees, advisory council. We have a PI group. We have an executive committee. And all of these different people have been coming together, really thinking about how we have this conversation and how do we make sure that we are engaging everyone in this. Because as we think about what matters to students and families and teachers in Maine might be different than another part of the country. So making sure that we are taking that consideration as we pull out those different elements within this roadmap. So we think about, well, I keep saying roadmap. Natasha, you keep saying roadmap. What does that actually mean? Let's talk about that. So within this final report, there's 4 different parts. On one hand, we have that introductory essay that sets the context, really robust writing. And then we have that second piece, which is that content roadmap. So within that, we have 7 themes that both hit a lens of history and civics. We also have design challenges that, again, bring that tension to the surface. And then we have a pedagogy guide. So as we think about these 7 themes of civic participation, of this EAD roadmap, you'll see on the webpage that you have a link that goes into a little bit more depth in terms of a description for each of these different themes. We're going to dive in and just look at one of the themes. But when we think about these 7 themes of the roadmap, we have civic participation, our changing landscape, we the people, a new government and constitution, institutional and social social transformation, people in the world, and contemporary debates and possibilities. And as we think about each of these different elements, each of these different themes, we can think of how those connect with our history, with civic education, and different topics that we might be discussing. So those content themes, what we've also done, one of the elements behind and the strength behind this roadmap is thought about it across K-12. Think about how many of us don't necessarily have the opportunities to have that conversation in a robust manner with our elementary students. And this is actually encouraging and fostering that conversation. So when we think about those content themes, they're broken into grade bands, and then we have these history and civic driving questions that really get at this tension and those challenging topics that we want to see us engaging with. So for a simple example as we see here, so a comparison between the current state standards. So think about how the main state standards might look. You might have a state standards that say, teach the French and Indian War, the Stand Back, the Boston Tea Party, Shays Rebellion. And sometimes it feels like we're going down the checklist and we're saying, okay, yes, got that, wonderful. But what EAD is actually asking us to do, and as we think about this, a new government, theme 4, a new government and the Constitution, it's asking us to actually change that narrative, right? It's what were the experiences with the British government or British colonists, Indigenous Americans, enslaved Americans, and indentured Americans? So right there in that first question, you can see where we're bringing to the surface some of those communities and some of those individual groups that haven't been brought to the surface before, okay? Or maybe aren't highlighted within those conversations. Thinking about then, how do we decide what is fair when we're part of a group? Which European empires competed for territory in North America and why? So not just simply being like going through the list and saying, have I covered this event and this moment in history, but rather, what was the complexity behind that event? Okay, so why did some colonists choose to be independent, to become an independent nation? Why did some remain loyal to Britain? Okay, constantly going back and forth and looking at that point of tension within these moments of history. So this is where you can have those robust conversations with students, because it is no longer a narrative of saying this is what it is, but rather let's have a conversation. What are the different perspectives that arise in this situation? What were the different experiences that happened in these moments in history? And as we think about how those elements are paired with these design challenges, what we see, and actually, before we jump into this design challenge, I'm actually going to go back 2 steps. No, we're just going to keep going. So as we think about this design challenges and we think about what happens here, what we see is we begin to see this complexity here. So so with this in terms of education, how can we support instructors in helping students move between concrete narrative and chronological learning, and thematic and abstract or conceptual learning? Kind of how do we go back and forth between those different elements? We see that that's really brought to the surface here. And these design challenges really allow us that space to do that, because in the past we've really just focused on either the chronological sequence or the themes, and we haven't gotten to go back and forth between that concrete and narrative space. As we think about the other design challenges and we think about how do we actually get to that hard history, okay? So just reading through these design challenges here, how can we help students understand the full context of their role as civic participants without creating paralysis and a sense of insignificant? How do we integrate the perspectives of Americans from all different backgrounds in narrative, our history? So thinking about e pluribus versus unum, how do we acknowledge that from its inception, Americans have simultaneously disagreed about the ideal shape of our self-government while also ultimately agreeing to preserve shared institutions? So we can see where we're going back and forth between these challenging elements and thinking about the tension around it and what this brings to the surface. Now, when we think about the instructional practices that go along with this, we see classroom-based democratic practices, direct instruction, discussions and debate, field or community-based activities, inquiry, project-based learning, really thinking about what those core elements are for history and civic instruction, making sure that we are pushing pushing the narrative so that we're not just saying, read about this and take notes, but how are you actually engaging with the content? So as we think about that really high level overview of this, of the history and civic roadmap, thinking about how does this sound? So I'm going to switch back to our Padlet now. As we think about these different levels, and I skipped our introduction, sorry about that. If you want to introduce yourself, please feel free to do so. But as we think about this back and forth, how does this approach to history and civics connect to your current instructional practices and state standards? So take a minute and scroll down. We're at number 3 now. And what I would love for you to do is take a moment and just stop and think. And think about, okay, as we have this high level overview, as we think about these tensions that are coming to the surface, how does this actually connect to our standards and what we're seeing? So we'll give everyone a moment. This is when I like to say I have wonderful wait time. Prior to joining iCivics, I was a 3rd grade classroom teacher and also the director of history and social studies for Boston Public Schools. So we love being able to stop and wait and take the time and not having a problem with it. So take a moment. On that Padlet, what you want to do is you just can double click on the Padlet and it'll give you space to type. And I just want you thinking about, how does this feel like it connects to your current instructional practices and your state standards? And how does this roadmap feel like it could be used to strengthen civic knowledge and critical thinking, participatory skills, and civic dispositions? And so often what we hear in terms of the connections, educators feeling like educators feeling like they have the opportunity to actually get more in depth with some of these elements. So that has come into the surface in many of our conversations. Getting to those opportunities that it's actually wonderful to hear about the tension that we actually want to be seeing in this. There we go. We start to see. So it feels like it fits with the standards that you currently teach. Wonderful. And I love when my Padlet does not want to auto update, but that's okay. So it seems like a great fit for the standards I currently teach. Incorporating civic knowledge into lessons and stories of history allows students to more bravely and confidently be more critical of actions. It does seem like we discussed the enslaved and indigenous as part of the history. Which is essential, and it's essential that we see that as part of this core of these elements. As we think about how do we do that in a way, and I saw someone briefly type in there that it often feels safe, and I'm going to let them finish their thought. But when we think about how this roadmap really creates that space, and so this individual, thank you for bringing this to the surface. It often feels safer to evaluate people of the past than current, more charged situations. That's something that we've seen brought up to the surface often in many of our conversations in our sessions with educators across the district, because you have the sense of the tension that can happen between the political spectrum, between how we can actually address these in conversations within the classroom and still maintaining a sense of communing, a sense of conversation and debate, and be able to create that space. I think something that what we're incorporating into the pedagogy document, and when we think about this pedagogy companion, what we're incorporating into this pedagogy companion is actually those elements to create that environment. So on one hand, we have very high expectations in terms of excellence for all and making this information so that everyone has the opportunity to engage with this rigorous content. But at the same time, when we think about the conditions that have to be created in order to be able to do this, in order to be able to do this well. So we think about what's the environment that has to happen within your school building, within your classroom, and we know that some of these elements are outside of our sphere of control, and we understand that there are some changes, that there might be some characteristics that might be happening in the entire school building that doesn't necessarily, that we want to see change with, and that takes time. Change takes time, but there are definitely elements that you can adapt within your own classroom, creating that space so that it's a supportive and inclusive environment, so that individuals can share their thinking, have a debate around a topic, share their authentic perspectives in these conversations. And but it has to be you have to get there, right? You have to create the atmosphere to have those conversations. And this also think we also think about within this work, um, what kind of communication needs to be happening at the school level. How are we messaging to our families and to our community organizations that this matters, and how do we communicate to them that we need to prioritize this when we're talking to students? I will say, when we're talking to students, so we had a feedback session with some students, and as they were raising issues and concerns, there were definitely, you could feel the difference between communities that empowered their students, and there were students had agency to engage in these conversations and these tensions, and then you had other students who were able to clearly say, our district does not raise civic education to the surface that to the level that it needs to be at, and that it's kind of pushed to the side because it's hard to have those conversations, and creating the space that you can take that risk to engage in that conversation within your own classroom. You kind of build a little bubble, so that you can do that, but then thinking about the larger context of the school community in order to be able to engage in that as well. And I think one of the other elements that we see throughout this whole throughout this whole roadmap is these different pieces in terms of this thread. So on one hand, you have this thread of vertical alignment. So that vertical alignment piece is essential, because if you want to get to this core of having robust conversations at the secondary levels, as they're trying to engage more with what's going on in society now, we have to build that foundation of knowledge and understanding and skills in order to be able to get there. So with this vertical alignment, what you see across those themes is actually this progression. And I'm going to scroll up for a moment. Sorry for making you a little seasick there. But I'm going to click on the full EAD roadmap. And what you see with this vertical alignment is you actually see this one theme brought constantly throughout the different grade levels. So as it's being broken up into, sorry for the scrolling there, as this one theme is broken into thematic questions, into driving questions, sample guiding questions, we see the depth continue on. But then you also notice that within this roadmap, you see that this conversation starts at K2, kindergarten to second grade, and then it progresses into ninth to 12th grade, really creating that space that your students are coming in, encouraging us to get to a place where our elementary students are engaging in some of this rigorous conversation that sets them up for success when they get to us at the secondary level. So we can see as these questions become more complex, starting with what makes a good leader, who makes decisions, what are the values and virtues, and you see that thread come to the surface here. And that's where we start with this conversation of civic participation. Students don't just suddenly know how to participate in our society. They have to understand the different elements, the different components, and gradually build up that thinking. So as you see here, that K to 2 piece, and so the grade bands that it progresses is K to 2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12. And though we know within those grade bands, that's a huge range. I mean, we think about our third graders compared to our fifth graders, or our sixth graders compared to our eighth graders. So there is definitely this range happening within that grade band, but really understanding that that conversation deepens over time, right? But there's power behind knowing that your students have had that conversation earlier and are continuing to engage with this. So it's not a one time and done element. Going to go back to our site here. So as we think about as we think about these pieces and this connections, so it will make it easier to have those tough conversations on current controversial issues because the youngsters are practicing those skills. Okay, knowing that they have those conversations really allows them to engage deeper. Now, as we think about this, I'm going to return to the slide deck for one moment. There we go. As we think about the goals within this project as a whole, and we think about, well, what's the actual ambition behind this? This whole theory of change is getting us to look broader behind. I know sometimes we are so zeroed in on these are our standards. Have I done them? Check, check, check. But as we think about the theory of change behind this project, it is establishing targets at state level, at local educational agency level, at national level. So thinking about all of these different levels and all of these different levers that have to change and have to move in order to reach these goals. So if we have a goal of all students are motivated to participate in civic life and have the knowledge and skills to do so well by 2030, we can't just tell our classroom teachers, go and do this, check. But thinking about, okay, well, at the district level, kind of what does that civic learning plan look like? How are we actually creating the space for to say that this matters, and we want to make sure that this conversation is happening in all schools? Think about that equity piece there. But then what does the state need to do? Thinking about, how is the state incorporating this in conversations? Thinking about how Joe brought us into the conversation. That's wonderful, right? That's acknowledging and that's saying like, hey, having this, engaging with this tension in history is actually really important. And then we think about, but we also have to hold kind of that national community and that federal community responsible as well in terms of how do we get all of these different wheels turning. And as I say that, I do want to say that this graphic is definitely a graphic that we're still developing, because there's this integral, there's this essential piece of tribal governance structures that we want to make sure is placed within this graphic accordingly and in the right spot, and not just assuming where it should go. So that is something that we've actually been engaging with our Indigenous communities and having a deeper conversation about this. And as I say the full release of all of this is kind of like the sneak peek. The full release of all of this is happening in March. So that's when we'll have finalized everything. But as we think about these different kind of levers of what actually needs to happen in order to make this change, we can see how this is very ambitious, right? But we, as was brought up kind of early on, we need to have the space to have those conversations, because we have to create the space in order to be able to engage. So as we get to this last question here, and then we'll kind of open up the floor to some different questions that you might be pondering. This last question here, thinking about when you felt your district or state was successful at making change. And sometimes, and I know Joe is doing a great job of making change. I'll give Joe, here's your plug. But as we think about that, thinking about what would successful implementation of this look like for your district and your state? So what would it look like to actually embrace these conversations that bring to the surface the tensions in history? What would it look like? What would it feel like? What would our students be doing? So take a moment and actually share your thoughts and ideas behind that on our Padlet number 4. Funding is always the question. So the last time we made big change, we had a grant that brought us time and coaches. Having those external supports and figuring out, how to build that community that can happen with that, I think is vital. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about as we've heard this thread of conversation that, whether it's, though we can't obviously staff coaches, but thinking about, well, how are we creating that time and space to have those conversations with some experts who can help guide us, right? So we think about, and in that sense, how do we leverage this digital space that we're in order to be able to do that, right? Everyone is definitely improving their digital literacy skills. So maybe it's an opportunity for us to, I know we had a request out with a group of educators that we talked to from Montana, and they were saying, well, we always, we wish we had more information about certain topics that are happening. So the Wampanoag and the colonization, thinking about some of those elements that we see in Massachusetts. So I'm currently located in Boston, just north of Boston, and over here it's like, no, everyone talks about that all the time. But so we can see where can we build relationships with other individuals from not just here, but across the country, right? So in order to get more depth and more of that information to our students. So when we think about that interdisciplinary connection, so I see that thread too in terms of having those interdisciplinary conversations, because as we think about civic education, these tough conversations, they're not just happening in our history classes, they're actually happening across the board. And how do we build that sense of community and that shared language, which is something that we can leverage this roadmap to do, create that shared language across our different content area experts in order to be able to do that. So the last big shift we made was a result of strong, articulate, if I could say the word smoothly, leadership who shared the vision. Having that shared vision is essential. I would like to see civics and history be the starting point of a change of the oh yeah curriculum that is often left behind. I think that's something that's empowering with this roadmap, is that it brings that to the surface right away. And with that element and bringing that to the surface so quickly, we see that these aren't stories that, we have to have a whole theme on that. No, these stories and these narratives are actually integrated within each and every theme. So it's not an afterthought, but it's actually brought right into the center of the conversation right from the beginning. So as we think about that too, that is essential. And thinking about these different pieces and these different elements that we see in this Educating for American Democracy roadmap, and we think about how those elements, as we think about the pedagogy companion that go with this, is how does it actually create this space and support teachers? I think that's also the key. So when I think about when I was in the classroom and when change happened, when we were successful, so yes, we had a shared vision. Yes, we had conversations across content areas, and we had the time. I think that time is essential. And I know that was mentioned in the first comment, but that time to have those conversations, because this work is not done easily, right? So if we think about our conversation today, just being a start to having that conversation a little bit about the Educating for American Democracy roadmap and those questions, but having that time to go more in depth over as we progress, as we work through different themes, as we try different things and strategies, we can definitely see where that would be a powerful element within shifting our instruction within the classroom. So as we think about that, I'm going to save our final thought for a moment. If you have any questions, I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen now. There we go. Hello, everyone. So as we think about the conversation with the Educating for American Democracy roadmap, if you have any questions, what are you wondering? What are you pondering? Now would be a wonderful time to put them into the Q&A, and we can kind of jump right in.
Does anybody have any questions for Natasha? You can also let me know. I'm familiar with everybody who's in the chat box, or who's in the participants box, so I do not have a problem with actually letting you speak up if you'd like. So Christy, I see you've posted a question. How long do you imagine this change work might take in a small district? So I'll give that question out there. I also see there's the question, is there a plan to roll this out to states? So Natasha, I'll let you take those two questions. And then also someone just let me know if you want to unmute. Tell you what, Natasha, I see you're looking. They're in the chat box or in the Q&A. I will let you respond to them as you see fit.
Wonderful. I know you have the side view of me looking to the side. Yes. So when we think about, we'll start with that question in terms of timeline. So when we think about this timeline, right now we are in the hustle and bustle of finalizing everything. And as we think about that, so there's a release that will be happening, a national release. So this is actually something that will be shared across all states. In March, I want to say it's March 3rd is the exact date, but there's a release in early March, we'll say. And at that, it'll be a national release. We have been engaging with stakeholders from across the country. So not just state education departments and directly with educators, but also with different organizations that are providing content for us. That are doing PD. So this has been a really robust conversation that has been happening. So with that being said as well, upon the release, we're not just releasing the roadmap, which you got a sneak peek of, but we're also releasing the pedagogy companion, which is also going along with that. But there will also be we'll also be releasing a website. And on this website, there will be resources, instructional resources that are open source, which is amazing, or open access, and all of those resources will actually be coded directly with the themes. So you'll be able to browse through the themes and see what resources that exist from a broad range of organizations and how that how you can actually use those into your classroom. That's one of the projects that we're working on, that we're in progress with right now, kind of curing those resources from different organizations. Because then as you dive into theme 1, 2, 3, as you dive into those themes, you can actually think about, well, what are the resources that I could use in my classroom? So as we think about that rollout plan, it's not just the report, the roadmap, and the pedagogy companion, but actually those 3 elements and a website that is housing it all with content. So that will be rolling out. So when we think about how will we measure outcomes? So actually, before we get to the outcomes, we'll jump over to the how do we imagine this work, how long it might take in a small district. I think understanding that all of this will take time. So when we think about this cycle that's going to happen within our history and social studies education space and our history and civics education space, we have this space where we have kind of, on one hand, we have communities that have to start with that concept of, we have to make sure that we have this understanding of excellence for all, and getting from excellence for all and understanding that growth mindset and sense of reflection that has to be happening within the school community, and creating the environment to have that conversation. That's one of the things we're definitely encouraging, is how are we fostering the supportive and inclusive environment to make sure we can have these conversations around tension. There are some districts that have been doing that, right? There are some districts that have been doing social emotional learning. There are some districts that have been having those conversations for a really long time, and they're jumping right along in terms of the concepts of inquiry. Okay, how are we doing instruction in the classroom that we have that inquiry? Okay, how are we not just asking those questions, but prompting students to engage with the content there? So we see these different pieces that are going to come together, and it's going to take time. And also think of I have a feeling that as we start going through this and districts start looking at these, specifically in that sense, the pedagogic companion, and you start diving in, it's going to be, on one hand, you're going to feel good and you're like, yes, we've been doing that. We've been having these conversations and priming our classroom environment to get there and to be ready to engage. And now we have some questions that can drive this. Wonderful. We're jumping right in there. But for other districts, they have to start at even understanding that all of our kids can access and engage with this content and engage in this robust conversation and debate. So depending on what you guys have been doing, it could take shorter, it could take longer, but I think also thinking of this as an iterative process. Okay, if we think of this as a cycle, you're going to go through and you're going to learn new skills and new strategies, and you're going to think about how you're giving your students agency within the classroom and within the school community, and assessing that. And then you're going to realize, great, now I can come back around and think about, how can I continue with this? How can I deepen my instruction within the classroom? So maybe we started with just incorporating debate more often into the classroom. Well, how are we now getting to a point that we are having these, bringing these tensions to the surface more readily? And then coming back over here to Alan's question, how do we measure the outcomes for students with the implementation of the roadmap. So one of the elements within the pedagogy companion, what we're trying to do is identify what would be the teacher moves and the student moves associated to this, right? If we want our students and our teachers engaging with this content, what would success look like? Okay, and really getting a deeper understanding of that, because with that, we can say, great, our students are now able to analyze these primary sources, build an argument, and that being one element, and we can see that. But what does it look like in all of these different realms? So part of the pedagogy companion is actually giving some of those, identifying some of those competencies that we would need to see happen when implementing the roadmap. Other questions, other wonderings? Is when you get the wait time dance.
Last call. Any questions for Natasha? Thank you for everybody for that last set of yes, because everybody put a question in. Nice job. You've all earned your star for the day. Last call, anybody? Last thoughts, Natasha, for them to think about?
I would just say as we release all of these resources for the Educating for Democracy roadmap and the pedagogy companion, just taking the time to kind of dive in and think about how are you actually kind of highlighting this tension in history and civics, and how are you incorporating that into your classroom?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. On behalf of the field and educators in Maine, I would like to say thank you, Natasha, for giving us an hour of your time and expertise and passion. And again, on behalf of the attendees, I would like to say thank you.
Thank you for having me, Joe. And thank you everyone for joining us in the conversation today.